Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest on, Kristi Storoschuk. She is a PhD candidate in exercise phys. Her research focuses on fasted exercise, lactate and glucose metabolism, and mitochondria. Kristi, hopefully I got your last name right. We practiced beforehand, and I told you I might get stage fright and mess it up, but hopefully I got it right, and really appreciate you taking time out of your day to hop on here and to chat.
No, that was perfect. I do have a question though. Does everyone get called special or am I actually special?
That is a good question. You are a special guest. Everyone is special, and everyone each brings their own unique skill set and education and everything to it. So everyone is special in their own way in that regard.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I found you through Dr. Mike T. Nelson's podcast, and yeah, I saw that you chatted about the mitochondria, and then your research is around that. So I thought you'd be a great guest to come on here. Real quick though, if you don't mind, how did you get to where you're at today in terms of being a PhD candidate and everything like that?
Yeah, during my undergrad, I knew I wanted to go into research. So at that time, I was really interested in like diet and nutrition. I grew up in the natural health world. My grandparents owned a supplement store that I worked at every summer from the age of 13. So I was exposed to nutrition as like a powerful tool that we can use to improve our health at a very young age. And so I knew I wanted to go into research. I was interested in the ketogenic diet initially because I thought it was really cool. It was the only diet that had a biomarker that we could follow. No other diet. You can know if someone's adhering to a ketogenic diet because we have ketones in the blood versus if someone's on a vegan diet or a paleo diet, et cetera, there's no way to actually track whether they're adhering. So I thought it was cool that there was signaling effects of ketones. And so I thought I was going to go into ketogenic research. I'm adjacent to that right now, but that was my initial plan. But then I started working instead for Dr. Dominic D'Agostino out of University of South Florida. And he gave me a lot of opportunities. So I was working with him in science communication. So I ended up not doing research with him, although I volunteered in his lab a little bit, but I was actually working for him and his company. And I rode that wave for a long time until I finally was like, hey, my initial plan was to go back to school and do my PhD. I need to do that. After getting some experience with Dr. D'Agostino, I applied to Queen's University, which is the nearest school to me now, where I live in Ontario, Canada. And there was a lab that studied mitochondrial function and mitochondrial adaptations. I knew that mitochondria were really important for health just because of the keto world. And there's a lot of talk about metabolic flexibility and mitochondria and ketone signaling in mitochondria metabolism. And so I knew the importance of mitochondria. So I was intrigued by this lab that studied mitochondria. And so I applied to that lab, and Dr. Brendan Gerd is my supervisor, and I'm in my fourth year of my PhD working with him. And so I'm looking at mitochondrial adaptations to fasted exercise, but I've done some systematic and some secondary research on fasting and mitochondrial adaptations. And then I have just a general interest in social media claims, zone 2 being one of them around mitochondria. So I've been doing some narrative reviews, systematic reviews alongside my actual primary research, which is my dissertation research. But the other stuff is just the fun stuff I get to do on the side in academia. But that's how I ended up in this position. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So obviously you've always had a love for the nutrition sciences, and then it just evolved over time and ended up working on the mitochondria. It's always funny bringing up the mitochondria because to me, I was never really into science when I was like younger. And then once I started getting into fitness and stuff like that, I started to get into it a bit more. Now it's just funny how like I thought the mitochondria was something that I was never going to hear about again. And now it seems like lately it's just like very popular, and it's important too, right? For good reason. But it's just funny how that kind of came like full circle there with
Totally. And I guess I also am really happy I ended up in an exercise physiology program because I could have very well gone down the route of nutrition. But I'm really happy that I landed here because everyone agrees that exercise is good. Nutrition is so convoluted and there's too many arguments involved. So I'm happy I ended up where
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the nutrition, man, that's a scary place to be around that. Like you said, and plus exercise, it's so freaking important too. I think people when they do argue with nutrition, it's like they leave out that key part of it, and it is so important there. As far as sorry, I lost my train of thought here, but so you are doing research around mitochondria now at this point. For you, I know you mentioned too that you always kind of had a love for like nutrition and stuff like that, and you tried many diets in the past. What does that kind of look like for you now? Is there anything that like you've settled on in terms of what you like to do for yourself, and what have you found there?
I've tried the whole gamut of diets. I started in high school with veganism, started CrossFit in grade 11. So I switched to paleo because that was the hot thing to do back in 2011. So I went like full force paleo, and then I went to like vegan paleo, which literally just meant I was eating fruits and vegetables. And that was not, I would not recommend that. And then I started incorporating more meats into my diet once the whole like carnivore nutrient density conversations started on social media, like probably 6 years ago or five years ago. That's when I started like really incorporating more animal foods and just recognizing and appreciating the bioavailability of nutrients and the nutrient density of animal foods. And now I'd say I've landed on just a whole foods diet. I prioritize protein. I don't worry about macronutrients. And I try to eat as close to like as local as I can. And through the summer, I have my own garden, so I grow all my own vegetables. We buy local meat. My eggs are from a lady down the road. So I try and just buy it as locally as I can. I try and prioritize whole foods. I don't really eat processed foods. I do gravitate towards a low carb diet, but not necessarily purposefully or because I think carbohydrates are bad or anything. But that's where I've landed. And it's I think I'm happy I've gone to all the extremes to find where that balance ends up lying for me because I've it's never been so liberating with food where I feel like I used to pack things to go to a restaurant and be a bit just crazy about food. And now I don't think about food at all. So it's nice to just have that balance now and find something that like frees your mind from thinking about, oh, what's healthy, what's not, and then enjoying. I understand that processed foods aren't inherently bad. There's context and nuance to everything. And I follow a pretty like restrictive diet, but it doesn't feel restrictive to me. And I think we also have to understand each individual and their relationship with food too, because someone might look at my diet and be like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Whereas for me, I'm like, wow, this is the most freeing thing I've ever had, I've ever landed on. So yeah, to answer your question, whole food, high protein, prioritize animal foods. I eat organ meats a lot.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that just, again, just your kind of experience with, like you said, the nutrient density of certain foods and stuff like that?
Yeah, and because we have a grass finished farm near me, so I can just get like really high quality organ meats. And yeah, like the nutrient density, like there's nothing, liver is one of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. So I just blend it up and mix it in with my foods and make sure I'm getting all my nutrients in.
Liver, that's one that, again, it's a weird, like, that's not a common meat, but like you said, there are, yeah, organ meat, but you've just found that, hey, I'm assuming it make it taste better. What's it taste like on that? I'd be curious to hear that.
Yeah, if you eat it on its own, it's definitely an acquired taste. Like I feel like if someone is not used to that type, I don't even know how to explain it, but it's almost an acetone. Like beef liver is a strong flavor. Chicken liver is much more mild and you can flavor it up. But to make liver, like honestly, I just blend it up and mix it in with my ground beef recipes. So anytime I'm making
Gotcha.
ground beef, I just blend like almost literally into a smoothie liver, and then I just stir it into my ground beef, and then I eat ground beef as I would or put it in whatever recipe. So that's one way to mask it. But yeah, there's a strong flavor, I guess, to beef liver.
What nutrients are common in, let's say, liver and stuff like that?
And you're gonna get all the things that are in red meat. So like our iron, our B vitamins. Vitamin A is really high in liver as well, which we don't get a lot of in the bioavailability form. But yeah, I'm probably missing others, but those are the ones that come to top of mind.
To go back to, you kind of mentioned you said that your diet's similar to a lowest carb style diet. Is that, again, just something you found through like preference, or again, just the kind of foods that you eat, or yeah, what kind of led you down to finding that being the, where you
Yeah, I
fit with
forgot to
carbs?
add keto into my repertoire when I was explaining all the diets I've done. Yeah, I did keto like hardcore too for about a year and a half, like measuring my ketones all the time. And I was working for Dom, so that I was testing different foods and different packaged ketogenic foods to test if they were actually ketogenic. If they kick you out of ketosis, then they're not ketogenic. And so Dom and I would do like testing, and I was like a female version, he was a male version, and we would just do like almost postprandial, like how you would measure postprandial glucose, we would measure postprandial ketones. And so I got to test a lot of different foods and stuff like that. But being in ketosis would have been required prior to the testing of that. So I actually really loved eating a ketogenic diet. At first, I started more like plant-based because this was like before I was introducing more animal foods. It's much easier to do when you eat animal foods, but you can still do it on like a vegan or like a more vegetarian style. But I prefer, yeah, I just prefer low carb. I don't know if I think I just like fibrous vegetables and meat. It's like you get to eat with fibrous vegetables, you can eat more food volume. And I like eating big meals. And by just eating like, yeah, lower carb, high fiber vegetables and then having your protein source, just something that I prefer. But like I said, it's not that I'm anti-carbs by any means.
Yeah, no, it's just the eating style that you found to work best for you and what you enjoy the most. I'd be curious because I know you're obviously into your training. What do you work on there with that? Is there anything specific that you try to do with your training? And then do you feel like that you don't really need too many carbs for the type of training you do? Or yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about that.
I think I'm an anomaly and I'm also a bad example of someone who's in exercise physiology because I work out fasted almost 99% of the time. I'll have like coffee, I'll have like milk in my coffee. That's like the extent of calories that I'll consume before a workout. And I do high intensity exercise. Mind you, they're short bouts. So I think we think that we need carbs before a high intensity bout of exercise, but high intensity by nature is shorter in duration because we can only sustain it for so long. And we have enough muscle glycogen from the day before. So unless you're on like a chronically, like a ketogenic diet where you're not restoring glycogen, and even that's argued, like keto adaptation, whether you're now better adapted to using different gluconeogenic substrates to be able to restore muscle glycogen. That's a conversation for another day and something that I shouldn't be the one you're asking about. But for someone who's like having carbohydrates on a normal basis, if you work out fasted, you have enough muscle glycogen stored from the day before to get you through that bout of exercise. And I don't think people appreciate that. I think when exogenous carbohydrates or pre-meal, pre-exercise carbohydrates really make a difference is when we're doing something that's longer in duration, up to an hour and a half, because it's all in relation to how much glycogen you're breaking down. And then it's also liver glycogen. So when if we're going to do a bout of high intensity exercise in the fasted state, our liver is going to respond by spitting out glucose into our bloodstream because our muscles are rapidly taking up glucose from our bloodstream and our liver's, oh crap, I got to restore that because we don't want blood sugar to drop too low, but it over responds. Then we get this spike in blood sugar. And that's beyond what we're taking up by the muscle. And we're also breaking down muscle glycogen at the same time. But if you eat before a high intensity bout of exercise, if you eat carbohydrates, you actually get a drop in blood glucose because you have insulin that's elevated pre-exercise, which shuts down liver glucose output. So now you're not getting the liver dumping glucose into the bloodstream, but you're also getting that glucose uptake by the muscle. So you're basically not replacing glucose into the bloodstream as you're taking it up because insulin is shutting down hepatic liver glucose output. But in the fasted state, you don't have that insulin elevated. So your glucose is able to, our liver glycogen is able to be broken down, put into the bloodstream in order to restore whatever's being taken up by the muscle. But like I said, it actually overshoots. So you get a spike in blood glucose versus being in the fed state, you actually get a drop in blood glucose with high intensity exercise. But you're starting from a higher starting point because you ate and you have higher blood glucose. But there is just differences in metabolism in the fasted versus fed state when we're exercising. But for me, like I said, I do shorter durations and of high intensity. I know that I prefer to be in the fasted state. Don't know, I can't confidently say whether like I would promote or recommend fasted exercise over fed exercise. I think, again, there's context, there's nuance. But at this point, I would just say that whatever you prefer, whatever gets you through the workout. The exercise is the important part. For me, I do fasted exercise. But that said, I've done longer things fasted. Like I did a triathlon in the summer and I did it fasted. I took about 60 calories worth of ketones in my water bottle, but I finished the Olympic distance triathlon. I'm not a triathlete. I just did this. I mapped it out around my house. I just did it for fun. But I've done things like that. And like my half marathons, I've PR'd all my half marathons fasted. I did a marathon and I only took 2 gels. I just first like I'm scared of introducing I'm like slowly experimenting with carbohydrates just because I'm so used to doing everything fasted or with minimal nutrition or only ketones or only MCTs before. But like I said, I'm not a good don't do as I do. Do as I say, not what I do.
What I guess a question for me would be like with your training, like what is your kind of main goal of your training? Do you have anything specific there that you like are working on? Or yeah, I think because again, like you said, it's all very like context dependent, right? So I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about what you do with your training and like what that's focused on.
My main goal is to have fun. That's all.
I love it.
I know exercise is good. I
Yeah.
know I wake up every day thinking, what sounds fun to do today? I am really good at pushing myself by myself and like choosing hard things that are also I also find fun. So that's an advantage and something I'm happy that I've adopted. So I try and move my body every day. I really enjoy functional CrossFit style workouts. I've recently gone into running, so that's why I've been like doing random things like a backyard marathon for one. But no, I'm not training for anything. I just know exercise is good for me. I'm convinced. And I try to move my body every day and I want to have fun doing it. So I end up like becoming fit while doing something that's enjoyable. Like if everyone could find a form of movement that they enjoyed, that's the golden ticket to healthy aging. We need to get people experimenting with different forms of exercise, whether that's cycling, whether that's a CrossFit class, whether that's F45, whether that's dancing, whether that's like everything. Like I think this whole idea of structured, okay, I lift and I do lower body this day and I do upper body this day. And then on this day I do cardio and that day, like I get it. That's fun. It's easy to program. People can follow something like that. But exercise is so broad. Like we have so many options and moving our body every day, like contracting our muscles, getting some sort of strength training in. We need to stress our muscles and both cardiovascularly and endurance wise and strength wise. However, I think that there's just so many ways to skin the cat, and I would love if people found a form of exercise that they enjoy. But to answer your question, no, I don't. I'm not training for anything specific. I'm training for life.
No, that's awesome. I do feel like a lot, like you said, a lot of people do end up like just focusing on like one thing. And again, I think it's always good to hear from someone that doesn't necessarily like have super structured or rigid training routine. It's more so just like you said for life. And I think that's awesome. So for you then, like, I'm assuming you measure something in terms of, what do you like to see? Do you try to see anything improve or anything like that? Or is it just, hey, again, I'm just training to enjoy, push myself, and that's good enough for me?
Every improvement is just a surprise. So if I get on the rig and I can do 5 bar muscle ups when the month before I could only do 4, that to me, I'm like, I wasn't deliberately training for that.
Yeah.
But now I can see my progress. Or running and I'm getting a faster 5K time and that I didn't necessarily deliberately train for again. I know I'm progressing, which is so I do track. I'm aware of my PRs and what I can do. And so I just keep random testing or within a workout, if I'm choosing a CrossFit workout and suddenly I can do something better, I know that, oh, I'm getting stronger and I didn't even know it. And that's fun. No, I'm not. I track all my workouts. Yes. I track my heart rate. I don't know why, but I love looking at my heart rate after a workout. I think working in a lab where we study high intensity interval training, I'm looking at people's heart rate every single day and it's fun. It's fun to see just because that is in an endurance context. It's related to our metabolic stress demand, our like cardiovascular demand of exercise. And that should be correlated, predictive, somewhat related to our adaptations to exercise. So I think it's fun to look at heart rate over duration.
Yeah, no. Yeah, heart rate's definitely super interesting there. And the reason I just asked all this is because, like you said, when it came to the nutrition and like fasting and stuff like that, it is context dependent. And so I guess for you, then really it just comes down to you just enjoy that. Now, I know you do research around fasting or fasted exercise. So in that research, is there anything that's led you to like, hey, I prefer it this way? Or again, is it just based off of like that's the kind of the setup you've had and you just like, I've always enjoyed that? Or maybe it's a combination of both.
So yeah, no, I've always been interested in fasted exercise, but it was really from like I thought fasted exercise, like I thought it was common sense that fasted exercise leads to greater metabolic stress. Metabolic stress leads to greater adaptation. So I thought that was just a known thing until I realized it was way more complex. Then there's a lot of other contradictory evidence. But I'm trying to fill the gap, I guess, with high intensity exercise. So a lot of the fast exercises related is conducted in moderate intensity exercise studies, whereas with high intensity training, we know a lot less. And honestly, the adaptation, so it's a lot of what's thought why fast exercise might be beneficial is because it manipulates fuel metabolism during exercise. So if you do a moderate intensity run in the fasted state, you're going to be burning relatively more fat than you would had you had carbohydrates before. And that's just availability. If you're eating carbohydrates, they're available, you're going to burn them. Whereas if you're in the fasted state, you now have to tap into your adipose tissue is now, one, insulin's low, you're releasing fatty acids into the bloodstream, you're using those fatty acids, glucose availability is lower. And so it's all availability. So you're able to manipulate fuel substrate utilization in the moderate intensity domain or low intensity domain. Whereas when you increase intensity, the differences between fuel substrate utilization disappear. So if I do a bout of HIIT in the fasted state versus the next day I do it in the carbohydrate fed state, my fuel substrate utilization should look identical, if very similar. And that's because the demands for exercise are just so high that we're relying on our intramuscular stores, which doesn't require whatever's going on with lipolysis from our adipose tissue or our glucose from our liver, because whatever's stored in the muscle is what we're going to use, whether we're in the fasted and fed state. And like I said at the outset, muscle glycogen is going to be the same regardless of if we eat or we don't, because our muscle glycogen isn't depleted overnight. So an overnight fast is not enough of demand. Fasting at rest is not a demand on our muscle. So our muscle glycogen is untouched. We wake up, we exercise, and if we're doing high intensity, it should look the same whether we're fasted or fed.
So what I'm understanding is when you say the key there with fasted exercise is the intensity at which you do it, right? So when you say it's less intense, that is going to be depending on, it's going to impact the fuel that you utilize there, right? When it's less intense, but the more intense it is, it's not going to impact it. So what that means is I guess the takeaway from that is if you're going to be doing higher intensity type stuff, you could potentially get away with fasting beforehand. And it's not going to impact performance. Is that not the case there?
This is where it gets interesting too. In my study, performance was not affected. So whether they were in the fasted or the fed group, they were able to complete the HIIT protocol, and RPE, so rating of perceived exertion, was the exact same. They were able to complete the same amount of work. Heart rates weren't different either. So everything looked the same between the groups, fasted and fed, but that's short term. So this is at like 100% of your max effort for a minute, 8 times. So minute on, minute off, eight rounds of that. It's really hard, but it's very short in duration. It's 8 minutes of work. So that was unaffected by fasting or having carbohydrates before. So performance wasn't affected. But there's definitely evidence that carbohydrate restriction would impact performance for high intensity exercise. I'm unsure of duration. So the shorter the duration, the less affected it's going to be. But if we're increasing duration and we're really actually measuring performance, then because what I'm prescribing is is just relative to their baseline fitness, versus if I was like looking at a specific power output or their max or something in the fasted versus fed, because I guess I wasn't looking at performance per se. I was just looking at their ability to complete the work that was prescribed for them. But there's evidence that carbohydrates do increase high intensity performance. So I don't know. I think it's going to be subjective, to be honest.
And so I guess for you then, where does that kind of lead you in terms of like next steps around this like research?
So I'm not even really interested in performance. I'm interested in health. So the benefits, mind you, the adaptations that promote performance are the adaptations that promote health. They're not mutually exclusive, but I am interested in how we can essentially manipulate our nutrition around exercise to get the best bang for our buck, the most out of our exercise, because people don't exercise. And if they do, a lot of people aren't exercising enough. So how can we essentially just squeeze as much out of that bout of exercise as possible to get the best bang for our buck? I don't know how this, I'm still blinded to my interventions, and I haven't fully analyzed my data. So I can't really speak to my data, but There's evidence in overweight, already a bit metabolically impaired individuals that fasted exercise results in greater health benefit in terms of insulin sensitivity. And this is related, one of the studies shows that this was directly related to how much fat was burned during each bout of exercise. So there is something about in one study what fuels we're utilizing during exercise and how that's influencing potential health outcomes associated with exercise. So that's where like I'm interested in just like what are our, because mitochondrial adaptations, yes, that's what athletes want. They want to improve their mitochondrial function because it's a determinant of our performance and our VO2 max and our aerobic capacity, but it's also a determinant of health. So that's where I'm interested in mitochondria is like, are we adapting to fasted exercise in a way that promotes greater mitochondrial adaptations and does this manifest as metabolic adaptation? So I'm looking at lactate threshold as essentially a proxy of fat oxidative capacity. And because mitochondria are a determinant of lactate threshold, we took biopsies in my study. So it does look like lactate threshold is changing differently between these groups, but like I said, I'm still blinded to the groups. But with the biopsy data, I'll be able to look at the mechanisms and see, okay, are our mitochondria, are our lactate enzymes responding differently, whether we're in the fasted and the fed state, and is this promoting different mitochondrial outcomes, and is this manifesting as a greater lactate threshold or greater glycemic control? Because I had CGMs on my participants, I was measuring postprandial glucose from start to finish and different glycemic outcomes. So it could be that fasted exercise has some sort of advantage, or fed, I don't know. I'll have to look at the group data once I'm unblinded. But in terms of the moderate intensity training studies that have been conducted, there is enough evidence to suggest that doing a bout of moderate intensity exercise in the fasted state might have an advantage. Just eating breakfast after your workout versus eating breakfast before. And it could be related to just glycogen turnover, fatty acid flux. Like instead of using exogenous fuels, we're now essentially mobilizing fuels that are stored, getting them through the muscle. It's like we're actually putting them through a flux from our adipose tissue, from our liver, through our muscle metabolism. And that might be related to some of our adaptations and the health benefits of fasted exercise. I just don't think it's strong enough to be like, oh, we all have to be exercising fasted, or what this means for a healthy individual versus potentially someone who's sedentary, who just started exercising, who's moderately insulin resistant or has type 2 diabetes. That like the population that we're dealing with is so important to consider when we're thinking about applying different nutritional strategies, because for an athlete, like carbohydrates are gold. Like we know that our performance is related to carbohydrate availability. So if you do a session at night, deplete glycogen, and then do a session in the morning in a lower glycogen state, your performance is going to be reduced. So carbohydrate availability is really important for performance. And that's where I guess I like feel a bit uncomfortable or hesitate, because I follow a relatively low carb diet and I do exercise fasted, but I do find that I perform well, which I don't necessarily think contradicts the research and the literature. I just think that I'm doing something differently than what an average sports nutritionist would recommend, but I feel good. I don't know, it makes me a bit uncomfortable because I want to obviously stay evidence-based and be applying what I know to me, but I also go by subjective feeling as well.
I think this is, first, I appreciate that you bring that up, because that is an important distinction there, where it's like, hey, this is what the research says, but this is what I do. I'm actually doing that research. But so I think the audience will appreciate that, you letting everyone know about that. But I also think it just goes back to, when it comes to evidence-based, yeah, we obviously look at the research and stuff like that, but part of it is what you prefer and what you enjoy, what you like. That's part of it, right? Of the evidence-based is also like what works for the particular person. And so like for you, it just sounds, hey, it's worked for you. You haven't seen any really negatives of it. So this is what I do, even though the research says something different. So I think it's cool to see that you don't necessarily have to just always follow what the research says either. You can use yourself as an experiment as well too, if you want to.
And like research is averages, and we are all individuals. And I'm not a coach, so I don't work with individuals. I don't work with athletes. So I'm sure there's a whole world that I'm missing when it comes to the application side, because I'm getting my information from papers, which again are averages of individuals. So I guess, yeah, when it comes to application, we do have to play around, but we use the science as basically our baseline and then figure it out from there. And like what the carbohydrate world in sports nutrition is rapidly evolving. Like people are consuming up to 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour for endurance sports, which is way more than what was commonly recommended in the past. So I think we're just still learning like what we're capable of. There's different mixtures of carbohydrates, different sources of carbohydrates, and just timing, everything, like the size of an individual's body, that's going to dictate how much carbohydrate someone should be consuming. And then, yeah, their baseline diet. There's just so many things that could change why someone might be experiencing something different than what they're seeing online or something like that. And it's also just respecting yourself, just being like, oh, I'm allowed to trust how I feel. Like you're allowed to, I think giving people permission to experiment and find what works for them. And if that doesn't align necessarily with what someone else is doing that you trust or respect, they're both okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it gets lost in translation in today's social media world. I think that's super important. But yeah, when it comes to carbs, it's interesting. I came from everyone, says carbs are like, it's like weird. It was like, oh, hey, carbs are bad. We want to go low carb. And then there's like a pendulum swings the other way where it's like everybody needs carbs. You can still lose weight with carbs. Like there's cases where everyone should have carbs. And then now, like for me, it come back to where, okay, there's the in between of certain people maybe need a little bit more. Some people need a little bit less. It's just carbs are the one that I feel like are just like super variable on like all the things that you mentioned. So again, finding what that looks like for you, I think is super important. And it's good to hear this type of stuff too with the carbohydrate stuff. I don't know. Was there anything you want to say on that? Because I do want to just sum up the fasting real quick, just so I make sure I understand where we're at with that.
No, you try and summarize what I just rambled about.
So with the fasting, it sounds okay. There is some potential health benefits of doing fasted exercise, but is like maybe the duration, the exact intensity, like those are things you're still trying to look at. And then also who exactly would benefit from it more so than other people. So like you mentioned there, like maybe somebody who's overweight, insulin resistant, hasn't really exercised, they may see a little bit more of a health benefit from that versus someone who's maybe like leaner, performing a lot more volume in a healthier spot generally. Is that kind of where we're at with that?
Yeah, yeah. If you're super active, then fasted exercise, like it could potentially be a tool. Like athletes use fasted exercise as a tool to, I guess, augment or amplify adaptations to endurance exercise. And there could be potential, like we have acute studies showing greater signaling in response to, so when we do a bout of exercise, we increase ATP demand, our muscle cells try and meet that ATP demand through mitochondrial metabolism, through cytosolic, that's when we produce lactate. And that demand elicits this signaling response. And those signaling responses are what precede adaptations to exercise. And then those adaptations essentially accumulate over time with each bout of exercise, and they manifest as some sort of functional outcome that we can see, whether that's performance, health, etc. And so the idea is that being in that fasted state is amplifying that signal because of how it's changing our metabolism. And then we're getting this greater adaptive response. And so athletes are using fasted training as a tool to essentially do this. And we do have some acute studies showing that fasted exercise does result in some of these greater signaling responses. And that's why these recommendations are what these recommendations are based on. I just think that there's still so much more research that we need. And athletes, like some endurance athletes have massive training volumes that like that's going to be a huge determinant of where, like how fast exercise would even play into someone's training volume. But yeah, like I said, for the average person who's maybe not exercising enough, these are just two wildly different populations. And it is interesting to think that, oh, athletes are using this, but maybe it's the people who are untrained that might benefit from it.
Now, I don't know if this is a repetitive question or not, but is this where maybe the fasted can potentially come into play? Is that this is irregardless of the energy balance that you're in as a whole, and that's where you can strategically use this there, or does that not really come into play here?
Yeah, when it comes to adaptations, it would be independent of energy balance. But that's a good point too, because if you're an athlete trying to use fasted training as a tool. So you're doing it purposely. Like you're thinking you're doing something for the sake of adapting to your bout of exercise. If you're digging yourself an energy deficit early in the day, because most likely people are doing their fast exercise in the morning, and you're unable to basically climb out of that energy deficit, and it leads you get to the nighttime and now you're in a calorically restricted state, and then you do that over and over again, that's very detrimental to your performance, because now you're entering low energy availability. You're going to get symptoms of red S. You're going to potentially be putting yourself in a state, like I said, low energy availability, which is associated with reduced performance, reduced recovery, poor sleep, increased inflammation, increased stress. Fast exercise could be a detriment to an athlete who has such high energy demands that food intake is their biggest issue. Like they need to be consuming calories, and that's where digging yourself a hole early in the day that you can't climb out of over the next 12 hours or whatever it is, that's where it could be actually problematic for an athlete.
But I guess maybe where my mind goes with this is, so let's say, so like I could see that, right, where they do that fasted and then they just are playing catch up the rest of the day. But from my understanding, the unique benefits of potentially doing fasted training would be like, hey, you could theoretically eat enough throughout the day, but you get these unique fasting benefits from training that you would otherwise have to be in like an energy deficit to get. But because you're an athlete, and we obviously want to make sure you're not getting to that low energy availability standpoint into a deficit and stuff like that. Is my mind going in the right place there with that? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Are you talking about an athlete population or just general public?
Right now, an athlete, because I could see where, again, I could see the benefits from like somebody that is overweight. But for an athlete specifically, if you want to get these specific adaptations from fasted training, the thing here that you could manipulate and work around is, okay, you're getting those fasted in the morning, but then the rest of the day you're eating an energy balance, right? To where you are fueling enough, but you get these unique adaptations from fasting.
That's the idea. It's independent of energy balance. It's not that, oh, now you're cutting out a whole meal and you're not making up for it. So now these two groups are eating different calories. No, it would be independent of energy balance. Yeah.
So I guess, are there any times when you like wouldn't use this or wouldn't recommend it? Is there any populations there that you are like, hey, I don't think this is a great idea?
So the athlete example that I just gave, yes. Otherwise, no, I don't think that there's any harm to fasted exercise. Like people think that females shouldn't be training in the fasted state because of cortisol or hormones or I don't know what storyline of the day, but I see no evidence for that. There's no evidence that females specifically shouldn't be training in the fasted state. I think females who might be, even non-athlete females who might be at risk of chronic undereating, then in that case, like it's the exact same as the athlete example. It's just that now they're using fasted training as like a way of restricting. And I think that's more psychological than it is like physiologically relevant, but because women online, social media, fasted exercise for females is generally discouraged, despite I see no evidence that we shouldn't be fasted, that we should be scared away from exercise in the fasted state. And if it has anything to do with cortisol, then I definitely see no evidence so essentially when we're fasting and we do a bout of exercise, we increase cortisol, we increase our catecholamines. This is a natural response to needing to mobilize our stored fuels. So these hormones and catecholamines, they bind to receptors, they tell our cells to release fuel, whether that's glucose from glycogen or fatty acids from adipose tissue. That's just a normal physiological response. It'll increase potentially higher in the fasted state, but that's because, we don't have any fuel on board. We need to get it from our stores. But then after exercise in recovery, it all comes back down to baseline. So this idea that like stacking morning, which cortisol is higher in the morning, just based on our circadian rhythms, stacking on exercise with fasting, this idea that it's all additive and now it's contributing to chronically high cortisol levels, I see absolutely no evidence for. I'd love to demystify that fasted exercise is more stressful and going to contribute to high cortisol levels, and that this is going to lead to some sort of hormonal imbalance, because low energy availability is associated with higher baseline all day cortisol levels. But saying that fasted exercise leads, like, just because B is related to C doesn't mean A leads to C in this scenario. And we try to make sense of physiology. Like social media tries to make sense of physiology by telling very convincing stories that don't happen. So in this case, in fasted exercise, I don't see a reason that females should be scared away from fasted exercise. I think if working out in the fasted state makes you sick, there are people who feel very nauseous. I've had participants say that they feel nauseous, and then and whether they're in the fasted state or not, I actually don't know. Maybe they are in the fed state, but that's a real response, and you should probably not work out fasted then if it makes you feel like you want to vomit every time. We're not trying to make exercise uncomfortable, but yeah, so those are some scenarios where fast exercises I would discourage.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up the sex differences too, right? Or the kind of myth that you hear there, because that was one question I wanted to ask you. So I'm glad you brought that up. But I would imagine too that the big issue at play is probably like what those people are doing from like an overall lifestyle perspective. Like you said, not the fasted cardio, this fasted training that's the issue. It's probably everything else they're doing, right? Sleep's probably not great. And again, like you said, we just want to make sure we're not in that like chronic, not eating enough all the time. That's where you could potentially run into some issues there. And those are the bigger problems at play, not necessarily the fasted training.
Exactly.
Cool. I think that's everything that I want to go over on fasting. Would there be anything else that you would want to add to that or want to share around fasting or anything like that, fasted training?
Not fasted training, but I guess fasting in general, if you wanted to talk about just like intermittent fasting or fasting.
I guess with that, I do want to hit on HIIT training because I haven't really gone over too much HIIT
Okay.
training with anybody. So because from my understanding, your main research is around like fasting exercise, right? Not necessarily like intermittent fasting and stuff like that.
I did publish on just the fasting response, but that's just at rest and based on like the idea that fasting is increasing our mitochondria or improving mitochondrial function, just fasting alone. So this is not with exercise. This idea that fasting is really good for our mitochondria because we're inducing energetic stress, our mitochondria respond to energetic stress, and then we're promoting this resilience and metabolic flexibility, and this should be good for health and improving glucose control and insulin sensitivity and all that jazz. But I went through all of the available literature and conducted a systematic review and basically found that fasting does not activate the pathways associated with mitochondrial biogenesis. And I'm very convinced that fasting is just not an energetic stress to skeletal muscle. And if we want to improve our metabolism, our skeletal muscle is our primary regulator of our glucose and fatty acid metabolism. And at the core of that are our mitochondria. So fasting, we shouldn't expect fasting to improve metabolic flexibility if it's not changing anything in our skeletal muscle. That's different from fasted exercise because now we're pairing two stresses, but fasting at rest it's just not an energetic stress. We're not breaking down glycogen. Our ATP demands are not exceeding what we can meet through fatty acid oxidation. And that's when our mitochondria adapt. Our mitochondria adapt to demand. And fasting at rest is just not increasing demand because we're not exercising.
Yeah, no. Okay, so what you're saying there again, that's hey, because that's what people will say, hey, you fast, you're going to get these unique kind of benefits. But you specifically looked at the mitochondria biogenesis. I guess for people that don't understand that, why would you want that? What would be the importance of mitochondria?
Yeah, like I said, mitochondria are at the epicenter of our metabolism. So it's where our mitochondria are regulating our glucose and our fatty acid metabolism. It's where we're producing ATP for our cell. If you've ever heard of the mitochondria, you probably have heard it referred to as the powerhouse of the cell. So this is where our cellular energy, the currency is ATP, and we produce that in the mitochondria. So we can use glucose and we can break down glucose into a form that eventually can go through mitochondrial metabolism, or we can use fatty acids. And mitochondrial biogenesis just means the making or the expansion of what our current mitochondrial pool looks like. And so we can build new mitochondria, we can expand the mitochondrial reticulum, and with this, we should improve our capacity to utilize fuels. And this is related to insulin resistance. It's related to fatty acid metabolism. So when we have poor mitochondrial function, low mitochondrial content, we're essentially just limiting our capacity to utilize fuels properly. And this is associated with metabolic inflexibility. So that we may be getting incomplete oxidation of like just incomplete metabolism. So we might be producing byproducts that are interfering with insulin sensitivity. So now we're increasing just these, byproducts that are just interfering with metabolism. And so if we're unable to properly use fats and unable to properly use glucose, then this can be problematic. We get a buildup of things that are just shouldn't be in our cells. We want to complete the oxidation, eventually leading to ATP production. And we don't want fuels just sitting in our bloodstream. So if we're unable to utilize fuels, then we get high triglycerides, we get high glucose levels in our bloodstream. And everything is just like a vicious cycle that kind of feeds on each other. And our mitochondria are really important for regulating both our fatty acid and glucose metabolism. And we want good, healthy mitochondria. We want a lot of mitochondria, and we want to use our mitochondria. And the only way to increase ATP demand, so the only way to essentially tell our mitochondria to start functioning and start moving and start producing ATP is to increase energy demand. So once we start exercising, that increases energy demand. We start producing ATP to match our ATP demands. And once we exceed our capacity of our mitochondria to basically match production to demand, that's when we get these signaling responses that tell our mitochondria to grow, to become better, bigger, stronger. So we exceed our capacity, and that's the signal. It's similar to resistance training. Like you push your muscles so hard that you tell your muscles to grow. And so with mitochondria, you demand ATP so fast that it tells your mitochondria to grow. And so that's why I believe exercise is the only physiological scenario that our mitochondria adapt to. And that's why sedentary behavior, so if you go from active to inactive, our mitochondria just adapt to the demand and we start reducing mitochondrial content and mitochondrial function. And then this is potentially what precedes metabolic disease. So inactivity, there's a lot of pathological reasons why inactivity would precede metabolic disease, but reduced mitochondrial function and content is one of the factors that is believed to lead to insulin resistance, poor fatty acid oxidative capacity, and then potentially disease.
I'm glad we brought that up because that kind of ties in what you just said there about fasting and how it doesn't promote mitochondrial biogenesis, because it's like essentially there you need the actual exercise part of it, right? I guess the myth is that you could just fast and you're going to get all these potential benefits, but okay, you need that exercise. So I guess my question off that would be, okay, so if somebody hears this, they know now the importance of good mitochondrial health. How would you know if you don't have that? Like, how would you know you need to improve it?
That's a good question. This is the only way I can think of is by getting a muscle biopsy and letting us look at your tissue in the lab. But my next study is looking at whether a lactate threshold, so your zone 2, if that is a functional marker of mitochondrial function, or I guess markers of mitochondrial content and function, whatever that means. I guess mitochondrial function is a bit of a hand-wavy term because there's no real consensus of definition for it. However, it's said on social media, again, that our zone 2 is this like functional marker of how well our mitochondria are functioning, because lactate levels during exercise can tell us about our fat oxidative capacity, and our fat oxidative capacity can tell us about our mitochondria. And so if we use intensity and lactate, we could it could provide a window into our skeletal muscle bioenergetics, mitochondria being a big part of that. So I'm doing a cross-sectional study, basically taking people's lactate threshold, which lactate threshold is just this uptick, a small increase in lactate above baseline. This first small increase in lactate above baseline as exercise intensity increases. So a lactate threshold curve, essentially you're increasing intensity very slowly in 3 to 5 minute increments in small increases in wattage on the bike, for example, or speed if you're on a treadmill or incline. And you'll see lactate, you'll find this point where lactate ticks up a bit, about 1 millimolar above baseline, which should be around 1 millimolar. So around 2 millimolars is one of the definitions. There's 28 definitions of lactate threshold. One of the definitions of lactate threshold. And so that once we hit that point, after that, as we increase in intensity, it's an exponential increase until maximal intensity. But that first uptick in lactate is considered our lactate threshold. And the greater your fat oxidative capacity, the greater the intensity associated with that increase in lactate. And so we want a high lactate threshold. Athletes really want a high lactate threshold because it also tells us at what intensity they start burning glycogen. If you have a high lactate threshold, you can go longer and at higher intensities before tapping into your muscle glycogen, which that means that you have more fuel in the tank for that end sprint or whatever you need for higher intensity exercise. So you can go longer and higher intensities. But it's also related to our health. So if you have poor metabolic function, so if you are insulin resistant, you most likely have a very low lactate threshold, and you also probably most likely have low mitochondrial content and function. So basically what I'm saying is I'm taking a pool of people across the spectrum of age and metabolic health and taking their lactate threshold, getting a muscle biopsy, and looking at their glycemic control and essentially triangulating that and seeing if lactate threshold is this functional marker of mitochondrial capacity and whether that can be used clinically, because that would be really cool if you did. I guess you'd have to go to some sort of functional clinic, but getting on the bike, increasing intensity, measuring lactate, and being able to assess whether your mitochondria, even with training pre and post, if you're like, you start a workout program and then 3 months later you want to go retest, then you could, if they are correlated, then you could take that information as, oh, I'm improving my mitochondria, which we know that training improves our mitochondria, and we know that training improves our lactate threshold. So I guess I don't know what's so novel about this other than it's just never been directly studied.
So it sounds like there's really no good way to know, but it's more so like hey, if you're like, you're looking at things like you said, like I guess glucose and like insulin, or your fasting insulin, stuff like that. If those are high, stuff like that, you're in poor metabolic health, we can assume you're probably not in great mitochondrial health, but there's not really anything that's going to necessarily tell you that. I guess my question would be like, if somebody is like, they live a fairly healthy lifestyle, can somebody like that, again, maybe they exercise a little bit, maybe they just do like more weights than anything. Could that person have a decent body composition, lift weights, and still have poor mitochondrial health?
Yeah, I mean, they could have poor, fatty acids. I wouldn't say they have poor mitochondrial health. I just think that they have room for improvement because our mitochondria adapt to resistance training as well. It's not that we're not utilizing our mitochondria, but endurance exercise is certainly more correlated to improvements in mitochondrial content and function. And in that case, so where my interest in zone 2 comes in is that high intensity exercise promotes rapid increases in, and it's like robust increases in mitochondrial biogenic signaling. So intensity is a really important determinant of the signaling response exercise that should precede actual mitochondrial adaptations. And with zone 2 is low intensity, very low intensity, but it's thought that zone 2 promotes improvements in mitochondrial function, which contradicts everything we know about high intensity exercise. And yeah, it contradicts both our physical activity guidelines, what we know about high intensity exercise. And then the way zone 2 is promoted is that, oh, we need zone 2 for health reasons because it promotes better mitochondrial function. But high intensity also promotes improvements in health. And VO2 max is one of the biggest determinants of our cardiorespiratory fitness, which is a big determinant of our health. And high intensity is a really important metric when we're thinking about improving VO2 max. And mitochondrial function, mitochondria are also a determinant of VO2 max. And so there's just a lot of lost connections when we try to add zone 2 into the conversation based on all of the evidence that we know about high intensity exercise. And I'm unable to find any evidence that zone 2 should be promoted over higher intensities for promoting mitochondrial health. If you have any questions about that.
Yeah. So again, you're talking specifically mitochondrial health here. And so it sounds like you're coming at this from a little bit more of a skeptic standpoint of zone 2 doing that versus, okay, you could just do HIIT essentially and get that same response.
Yeah. And I think you're more, okay, one, there's just very limited evidence directly studying zone 2 training. 2, the arguments seem to be entirely based on what athletes do, endurance athletes have huge training volumes and they spend a lot of time in zone 2, supposedly. 80% of their training could be spent in this low intensity training with 20% being in high intensity. But that 20% in a very large training volume is a lot of high intensity exercise and most likely more than what anyone is doing who's just like a general member of the population. So to correlate that 80% to this high mitochondrial capacity of endurance athletes is, what if it's that 20% that's promoting the high mitochondrial capacity? We're giving so much value to that 80% without considering how much high intensity they're doing. And it seems to be based on the fact that, oh, we're promoting fat oxidation. Because zone 2, we're going to be burning. Zone 2 is lower intensity. We're burning more fats relative to carbohydrates. Fats are burned in the mitochondria, and so is glucose as well, but at certain intensities. But the idea is that, okay, burning fat and maximizing how much fat we're burning during exercise, and therefore maximizing mitochondrial metabolism, should be promoting better fat oxidative capacity and mitochondrial adaptations. And that's the argument for zone 2. Is that your understanding? Would you agree with that based on what you've seen?
Yeah, that's definitely the argument there for zone 2. And my thought on it is, like you said, a lot of that is also just based on the fact that, like you said, they take it from these like endurance athletes who do a ton of training, and it's somebody that can only train a couple hours a week. That's completely different. And again, that was my intro into cardio, was, hey, more zone 2, but now like my mind's kind of shifted more towards, hey, the less you do, the probably more intense we want it to be, right?
100%. Yes, that's exactly where I would land. Like the smaller the duration, the higher the intensity should be. So we don't have 20 to 40 hours to dedicate to exercise a week like some of these athletes do, who are doing these huge volumes of zone 2. And like I guess my like biggest issue with promoting zone 2 is that it's doing something inherent that we can't achieve through higher exercise intensities, which is just not supported by the evidence. There's no inherent benefit to being in zone 2 that we're not going to get at higher intensities. And I'm convinced we're getting more benefit in higher intensities. And we could be potentially limiting the benefits of exercise by staying in zone 2. I think that there's a potential threshold, which might be around our lactate threshold, which defines zone 2, that we need to be above, and then increasing and then accumulating as much volume above zone 2 might be actually associated with the best adaptations for both performance and health reasons. And the way it's promoted is that, oh, you can't go above a certain intensity because now you're going to negate the benefits. You're going to miss out on those benefits that you're getting in zone 2, which is not supported by any evidence that I've come across, and I've tried to dig very hard.
So I guess then for you, like, what would you recommend for, again, somebody that doesn't have all these hours? Is there a certain dosage that you would say you find? Does that mean you just want to do HIIT all the time, or is there a way that you can be smart about, like, what does that kind of look like then for you?
No, I would never. I don't have an answer on like specific dosages. Like the physical activity guidelines are based on rigorous science. So physical activity guidelines are at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise or 75 minutes of vigorous exercise. And they state that vigorous exercise might be more important for improving VO2 max, which is cardiorespiratory fitness, which is what we want from our exercise. So also I want to preface that I don't think like zone 2 training is not bad, but if we're using it as a way to improve our health, then we're potentially missing out on benefits of higher exercise intensity. So I would never sub out my high intensity exercise for zone 2. I think I want to go hard all the time, but that doesn't mean like balls to the wall. I mean, okay, maybe I'll do 40 minutes in zone 3. It's not zone 2 versus I want to die. It's why are we staying in zone 2 when we could be accumulating volume above zone 2? And also just, I don't know, there's just too much prescription involved. Just do something that you enjoy. But there are benefits to going harder. If you feel like you can go harder, then go harder. But no, so 150 minutes is the bare minimum. And I do think that we all need more than that because there's some evidence that's not enough to improve cardiorespiratory fitness and health. But that would be the bare minimum. And then 75 minutes of vigorous exercise. HIIT, I get 75 minutes if I had to do the math on HIIT, because some HIIT is extremely hard. But you can get away with 1 to 2 sessions of HIIT a week and be getting good benefits. But my study was 5 days in a row, just consecutively. Monday to Friday, they came in and did a bout of HIIT. And they're fine. My participants were fine. Also, my females were fine. But no, like dosage wise, I would be uncomfortable saying anything other than like what the physical activity guidelines recommend.
So what it sounds like here is you're not saying, hey, zone 2's bad. It's not like you're going to go backwards. It's just you wouldn't have that be the thing where it's like you need to hit some certain amount. And if you go over at zone two, you're not like also doing something bad. It's just, again, you wouldn't replace your like higher intensity stuff with zone two, especially if you're not getting a lot of higher intensity type training in already there.
Yeah, I would prioritize high intensity, and then whatever's not high intensity, then I would try and just do moderate intensity because these nomenclature is a bit confusing. If we think of zone two as low intensity, then
Yeah.
I'm not purposely doing low intensity exercise ever, actually. I only work out for, I don't know, 30 minutes a day, and I don't deserve zone two. And I don't think there's unique benefits to zone two. And I think that I would potentially be getting less benefit out of my exercise if I purposely did zone two over higher intensities.
And it's boring too.
Yeah,
That's at least my experience with it.
And if depending on your fitness, zone two, okay, so this is one potential argument for zone two and why athletes might benefit from zone two is because their zone two is crazy wattage. If you're an endurance athlete and a professional athlete, zone two on a bike is over my maximal capacity. So they might, just because that amount of demand is so high that even though their lactate levels are low and they're in zone two, just the amount of muscle recruitment, like the energy demand of that zone two bout, that could be doing something that's promoting adaptations that someone like me wouldn't get because my zone two is so much lower. And then even beyond that, so recommending that like people with metabolic disease, so say someone who has insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, that they need to be doing zone two. One, again, preface, I don't think it's bad for them. I think it's better than not doing anything. I do think that we should be promoting as hard an effort as they can do. And that's going to be over zone two, because if you are metabolically impaired, your zone two is a brisk walk. So saying that, oh, you need to be brisk walking to improve your health, I think that's not wrong. But I think saying that it's better than higher intensities is wrong.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up a good point, how it's all relative to your current state of fitness as well, too, right? Like you said, someone's hit maybe your zone two and someone's zone two maybe your hit, right? So it is all very relative to that specific person. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what I currently do from a cardiovascular standpoint. It's like my main goal is like hypertrophy, right? Like body comp is my main thing, but I've really come to be like, hey, cardiovascular fitness is super important and improving that. And so I've spent a lot more time focusing on that. So I do 3 cardio sessions a week on the bike back here. I do a hit style. It's usually 3 minutes for 5 rounds, something like that, give or take a few minutes, plus or minus there. Another day of like zone 3-ish, where it's a medium intensity for 30-ish type minutes. And then I'll do a slower ride, longer ride, kind of your typical zone 2. Grade that overall in terms of what my goals are.
Yeah, like I've said with like almost every topic, there's so many ways to skin a cat that like I think that's perfectly fine. I think that if you didn't want to do that lower intensity one, then if your goal is to improve cardiorespiratory, if your cardiovascular performance, then I think you could maybe get a better bang for your buck if you went a little bit, if you did 2 moderate intensities and 1 hit, or you did that lower intensity, but you added some sprints in there. So the sprint interval training literature is actually crazy because there's some studies that are like 10-second sprints or just 30-second sprints a few times that are increasing VO2 max, which is crazy. Not being afraid of just like adding in some random intervals. And we have these protocols within the literature and we try and find like the best one, but I won't say arbitrary, but you can make your own. You can do whatever, sprint as hard as you can for 20 seconds or 30 seconds, or whether that's a minute going hard or whether that's up to 4 minutes going hard. You're going to be getting that stimulus for your muscle, for your heart to adapt, your vascularization. That's when we're putting so much demand on our cardiovascular system, that's when we adapt. That's when we tell the body, like, we need to basically build the roads to get oxygen and nutrients and blood to our working muscle. And then our muscle responds by being like, we need to be able to extract this. So let's build new mitochondria. Let's build these enzymes and transporters so we can get all this into our cell and use it for next time that we're stressed again. So I don't know, doing something that seems fun to you that also gets your heart rate up and makes you feel like you can't sustain it for very long. I think that your HIIT session's great, moderate intensity is great, low intensity, I'm definitely on the fence about. I don't think it's bad, but I think that if your goal is increasing VO2 max, then I don't necessarily think it's a huge contributor.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. So again, it just kind of sounds like from the lower intensity standpoint, you're just still mixed on it. And obviously you'll do a little bit more research around it, and that may or may not change your mind, but I'm assuming you're skeptical on if it will actually change your mind there.
I don't think burning fat improves our capacity to burn fat. I think we need to exceed our capacity to burn fat to tell our body you should be better at burning fat.
It reminds me that, as you're talking about this, it reminds me a little bit of on social media, you'll hear people talk about like the hypertrophy research and like what to do with that. And as I learn more and more about hypertrophy research, it's like people get caught up in these nitty gritty, like how long does your rest need to be? How many reps, how many sets? And it's at the end of the day, you just need to provide that stimulus over time that is more. And that's really how you're ultimately going to grow there. And the same thing with the cardio. It's, do I need to be in zone 2? Hey, I was a little over my zone 2 heart rate. And it's okay. That probably doesn't matter. And as you're saying, you probably want to go just push it harder and make it hard. And over time, you'll get the adaptations that you want.
Yeah, I will say, I think the longer intervals are associated with greater increases in VO2 max, like up to 4 minutes. So if you wanted to try a 4-minute protocol, we have one in our lab, 4 minutes on, 3 minutes off times 5. And it's really hard.
Yeah. My coach just recently started putting that in for me the last couple months. And to me, the trick is when you do these longer HIIT intervals, like to me, longer would be like 3, 4, 5 minutes. Maybe it's like you need to go hard enough, but you probably also don't want to gas out in the first minute. Or am I completely wrong on that?
No, we keep the same. Every interval should be the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it just gets harder.
Yeah. And that's the tricky part, is like making sure you're pushing yourself hard enough, but also not flying out of the gate there.
Yeah. I don't know if your bike has if you can control the watts on your bike, or
like the power output essentially.
Yeah. And be able to just keep it consistent from interval to interval. That would, I guess, how things are programmed in the science.
I don't know if I can do that, but I just try to maintain the same speed essentially the entire time.
Yeah. If it's set at a certain, so I have a bike erg. So if I put the damper at a certain setting and then have the same RPMs, then it should be the exact same interval.
Well, Kristi, I want to be super respectful of your time. I already went way over what I said we were going to. I guess, is there anything else that you want to add from what we talked about today? And then maybe can you give a couple just main takeaways from what we chatted about today?
Okay. First off, thank you so much for inviting me on. I've had a lot of fun and this flew by. I wish I had better answers for you and more concrete, but that's not how science works. But if I were to sum up, I think that there are potential benefits to exercising in the fasted state, but we need a lot more research. But I don't think people should be forcing themselves to exercise fasted if they don't feel comfortable. And I think that everyone should be prioritizing higher. When I say high intensity, everyone thinks, oh my gosh, I need to die. Yeah. No, just accumulating as much volume, so as much duration of time with hard efforts here and there. I think intensity is really important for promoting the adaptations that promote performance and health. I think that eating, if we're going to tie in nutrition, finding a diet that both fits nutritional requirements, supports the body composition, that like a healthy body composition, I think that's what we need to find. So whatever that means for you, sustainability wise, might require some experimenting, but it probably will be a diet that eliminates processed foods as much as possible, because I don't think a large contribution of our food intake can be processed foods, and that we are able to properly live with healthy body composition. I just don't think those two things exist unless you're a crazy athlete. And that, I already touched on the high intensity. I just think we all need to find a form of exercise we enjoy. I do really strongly believe in the importance of strength training. It's just not my research. I don't necessarily talk about it, but I do it. And that's it. Those were really bad takeaways, but
no, that was awesome. I asked a lot of you there to like, just, hey, what do we talk about? Sum it up. So no, that was awesome. I guess my last question is, where can people find you? Where can they find more of your work, etc.?
I guess I'm the most active on Instagram, Kristi Storoschuk. Hopefully that's just linked somewhere.
I'll link it.
I do have a website if you want to reach out, but I don't really use my website that much. And I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Awesome. Cool. Kristi has a ton of great information here. Really did enjoy chatting with you. Ended up being a very special guest for sure. So appreciate it. But cool. Yep. Thank you for hopping on, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. I've had a blast.